I started at the ASPCA, which has a full-service animal hospital in Manhattan in New York City in 1988, and did clinical practice there until 2005. And then there was about a 10-year overlap from 1995 to 2005. It's amazing how the years pass, where I started working with our humane law enforcement group. The ASPCA, I'll do a little history during the presentation, was founded in 1866, and from that time forward had a humane law enforcement group, and that is until 2014, January of 2014. And what happened in January in 2014 is what this picture illustrates, is that NYPD took over in New York City response for all animal cruelty complaints. So very significant change in how animal cruelty is addressed in New York City. In 2013, the last year that our humane law enforcement group, the agents were active, they brought 150 animals during the year to the hospital. Last year, 2015, NYPD brought 700, and this year we're on track for 800. So there's a significant difference, and the difference is that there are 34,000 uniformed police officers in New York City. They work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They have a responsibility when there's a complaint, and complaints go through 311 and 911 to respond to that complaint within a number of hours, within 8 hours, basically, a shift, unless it's at the end of a shift, and then it would carry over into the next shift. But the idea is that the ASPCA is expert in animal welfare, animal care. NYPD is the local expert in law enforcement. So why not let NYPD do what they're experts in? And there was work over the course of a year or two to make that switch, and it's worked out very well. The overriding message that I want to communicate to you, because this is a field like any other, and there's only so much you can say, even in a 3-hour period, is that animals are connected to us. People and animals can't be separated. They're intimately integrated into our lives, and things that happen with animals are always connected to things that happen with people. That's one of the reasons that it makes sense for local law enforcement to respond to all crime, including animal crime. You can't really separate what's happening to the animals in terms of criminal activity from what's happening to people. So if you separate it out and you have, the police department not responding to animal crime, things are going to be missed that will be less likely missed if they're the ones responding to the complaints. Yes?
So what was the difference before the NYPD took over, I guess?
So we had a humane law enforcement department, okay, and there were 18 agents in 2013. We still have I guess it would be more like a humane law department with some very experienced former NYPD, and I'll discuss that. That's probably a 2 o'clock lecture. But they just couldn't, it's hard for a private not-for-profit to, number one, in a city of 8 to 9 million people, have the resources to respond, especially when there's, another group that should actually be responding and can respond. And it's worked out really well, and NYPD has been completely on board with the change, as you'll see. So just to start out with a question, who here today has worked on an animal cruelty case? Oh, that's great. Probably at least 2/3 of the audience raise their hands. Sometimes I don't know when I present to different groups who's had some exposure. Recognizing and reporting is a well-known phrase that was first used with child abuse, and now it's used with animal abuse. The text on the left was produced by American Humane almost 20 years ago. It's out of print. But as far as I'm aware, it's the first text that connected veterinarians to animal abuse. I don't know if you can still get it. When I first started doing this, which was around that time, I was looking for any material that would sort of help me understand what I should be doing as far as animal abuse cases. There really wasn't much, certainly didn't. It wasn't being taught in veterinary schools at the time, and it's beginning to be taught now, but it is 20 years later. I actually have made a photocopy of that and then scanned it, so if anybody's interested, I don't think American Humane would be concerned. I can contact them, but if you wanted to get a scanned copy. The book on the right is my favorite book on forensic veterinary medicine. It's written by Ronald and Helen Monroe. They're two forensic veterinary pathologists in the UK. It's very straightforward, it's simple, and it's very practical. And it's a very good reference. So the idea behind this presentation is just to give you lots of different materials, sort of an overview of the subject, and things that I've come across that have been significant to me trying to doing forensic work with animals. So there was an English artist, his name is William Hogarth. In 1751, so 250 years ago, he created a series of 4 engravings that were a way for him to communicate to society in general the problem with animal cruelty. So this is not a new subject. And these engravings were mass-produced and they were handed out. And basically, they show the life of a fictional individual named Tom Nero. The first engraving shows him abusing a dog. The second engraving is him as an adult abusing a horse. The third engraving is him killing his pregnant lover, who he convinced to steal from her mistress. And the fourth engraving is after he's been executed and now he's being publicly dissected. So, but the idea is that even back then there was a connection between animals and people, and it was recognized by this artist. So I'll go quickly through these. They're available online very easily. There's a lot of symbolism in them, so it's interesting if you can find a reference. And I know, for instance, Wikipedia has a pretty nice write-up on these. It's interesting to see all the symbolism and everything that's going on in these engravings. So here's the first one. I'll use the laser pointer. This is Tom Nero. I'm not going to tell you what he's doing to the dog, but here's the dog. Another person tying a bone to a dog's tail. 2 cats hanging on this yardarm. So cat being thrown out of the window up here. There's a lot going on. Unpleasant. Here he is when he's older. His horse has a broken leg and he's beating his horse, and there are other things happening as well. The second stage of cruelty is what he called this. Third stage of cruelty, there he has killed his pregnant lover. Again, a lot of symbolism going on. And then finally, he's been executed. He still has the noose around his neck, and he's being publicly dissected. So again, the point is that, and for all of these presentations, we can't be not connected to animals. We're connected to them, and what happens to them happens to us, and it's been known for a long time. The ASPCA was founded in 1866 by Henry Berg. He was well-to-do, lived in New York City, was connected to local, state, and federal government, became a diplomat, traveled in Europe, saw a lot of animal abuse in Europe, and then during a time in London, came across the RSPCA, which was founded 22 years earlier. and thought, well, we should have that in the United States. And there wasn't at that time any kind of animal welfare organization in the United States. So he came back to New York and founded the ASPCA. And here again, this is a famous quote of his: "Mercy to animals means mercy to mankind." So again, connection of people to animals. And it's just been known about for a very long time, and to some extent, that's where forensic veterinary medicine is coming from. Another connection between people and animals, there were actually, as a result of the founding of the ASPCA, there were animal cruelty laws before there were any laws about child abuse in this country. And this is a relatively famous case. The girl was an orphan. Her name was Mary Ellen Wilson. She was being abused by her foster family. A woman named Etta Wheeler was aware of this, went to Henry Berg to see if he could help because he had helped animals. And the counsel for the ASPCA was able to get her removed from that household. She ended up living to be in her 90s into the 1950s. That was sort of the creation of the first child protective agency in the world, called the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And initially they shared office space with the ASPCA. And it's still in existence in New York City. So if you, there's a, my presentations aren't on, is it a website? I'm not sure where you can go, but they will be after today. So all of the references will be available to you. But that website address is current. When I first started working with our humane law enforcement agents, again, I was looking for any material that might provide me with a framework for how I should approach animal cruelty cases. And it seemed like, well, there's a lot that's been done with child abuse, so I'll look at that. And that was very worthwhile. The federal government has something called the Child Welfare Information Gateway. The URLs are on the bottom. And the part of that that was very valuable is they created what's called a user manual series. So as you may be aware, with child abuse, there are many disciplines that are required to report if they're aware of suspected child abuse. They're called mandated reporters. So teachers, physicians, law enforcement, firemen, firewomen, fire people. But a lot of different disciplines, including in some states, veterinarians are mandated reporters for child abuse, even if they're not mandated reporters for animal cruelty. And that was a useful guide early on for me. This is the first article written about child abuse to some extent, the battered child syndrome. It was written in 1962, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the lead author was Dr. Henry Kempe. And this is very worthwhile reading because it gives you the same sense of, as a veterinarian, what do you do if somebody brings an animal to you and you suspect that the animal is a victim of abuse. And the same issues that they were dealing with back then as far as children. But this was actually the beginning of child abuse being taken seriously in this country. The federal government got involved, and now in all 50 states there's mandated reporting of child abuse. This was the beginning of that movement. So a little bit of history is there's something now called the International Veterinary Forensic Sciences Association, IVFSA, that was formed in this country in 2008. It was the result of some people at the University of Florida and a couple of veterinarians who were working on some animal cruelty cases. There is, at the University of Florida, the Maples Center for Forensic Medicine, not veterinary medicine. There is a vet school there in Gainesville. But there was a forensic scientist who's actually a forensic entomologist who was working with another veterinarian on cases. And UF has a very significant continuing education department. Said, hey, why don't we do a conference for veterinarians on forensic veterinary medicine? Hadn't been done before. There had been some day-long parts of conferences. I know that I was part of a day-long work on forensics back in 2001 at what was at that time the Tufts Expo, but there wasn't anything really structured. And the expectation is that maybe 30, 40 veterinarians would show up and 180 people showed up. So the question was put at the end of the conference, what does everybody want to do? And everybody wanted to form an association. So that's how this started. And it just really sort of happenstance that this veterinarian had originally reached out to the forensic entomologist at UF, and then this happened. So there's now been an annual conference since then. Next year in 2017, it's going to be in New York City. Up until this time, it's been in Florida each year, primarily in Orlando, although we were on the beach in St. Pete this year. That was fun. It's going to be in New York next year because of the ASPCA NYPD partnership. And what a significant change that has made in how animal cruelty is addressed in New York City. So that first day, it's a 3-day conference, will be the NYPD ASPCA partnership. And because it's not just a veterinary issue, there are attorneys, law enforcement, all different kinds of people are going to be speaking that day. And that's in, I think, May 16th through the 18th next year. In addition, in 2012, the University of Florida, in conjunction with the ASPCA, started an online master's degree program in veterinary forensic medicine. And the initial 5 courses are considered the core courses, and they give, if you finish those 5 courses, a certificate in veterinary forensic medicine. And subsequent to it being started in 2012, it's now been expanded to a master's degree. And that would be 10 courses. Each of the courses is 3 credits. It is all online. You can do either a non-thesis or a thesis track for the master's degree. There are 2 types of state laws that are of interest to veterinarians that have to do with animal cruelty. One are laws that define animal cruelty, and then the other laws are ones that address veterinary reporting of animal cruelty. An animal presents with severely compromised health to an animal hospital or an animal shelter. Who decides if the animal is a victim of animal cruelty? Does anybody want to answer that? One person responded veterinarian. Anybody else? Any other thoughts on this? Law enforcement, okay. So animal cruelty is a legal determination. It's not a medical determination. I won't grade you. And in New York State, it's defined by Article 26 of Agriculture and Markets Law. It's in Agriculture and Markets Law because it happened at the same time that the ASPCA was founded, and we were an agricultural society at that time, so that's where it is. And it stayed there. It's not in what's called the Penal Code, which has been a little confusing for law enforcement all these years, because what they look at is the Penal Code, not Agriculture and Markets Law. But it's applying the law to a particular set of circumstances is the responsibility of law enforcement and the prosecutor's office. So it's not a veterinary responsibility, which is nice. And I wouldn't want to do it. This is what we call cheat sheet that was produced by our Humane Law department, and it just gives a very quick breakdown of all the different laws that address animals in New York State law. 353 and 353A are the 2 actual animal cruelty laws, specifically animal cruelty 351 is animal fighting, which is separated out and actually has a more serious penalty if you're found guilty of animal fighting than animal cruelty. So if you're interested in a resource for animal law, and animal law, interestingly, is an evolving area of specialty for lawyers and attorneys, the same way veterinary forensic medicine is evolving for veterinarians. There's a great website by Michigan State University called animallaw.info, and it surveys the country. It's not just for Michigan. And it gives laws, they're all different. For instance, there are tethering laws in lots of different jurisdictions, and they vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and some places don't have a tethering law. New York has a tethering law now for just a few years. And our law says that an animal can't be tethered in New York City for more than 3 hours out of a 12-hour period. But it depends on the particular location, what the law would be, and it varies. And then the Animal Legal Defense Fund also has a great summary of animal law. The Animal Legal Defense Fund has been around for a while. There weren't that many student chapters in law schools way back in 2000, but now there are hundreds. So animal law is evolving the way veterinary forensic medicine is evolving. Simple question, is the legal definition of animal cruelty the same in New York as in Massachusetts? Correct. So there are 50 state laws, and depending on where you practice, the laws are going to be different. And because animal cruelty is a legal determination, how animal cruelty is prosecuted is going to vary from state to state. So this is New York State's misdemeanor law. The language seems relatively archaic. A person who overdrives, overloads, tortures or cruelly beats or unjustifiably injures, maims, mutilates, or kills any animal, whether wild or tame. It talks a little further later, deprives any animal of necessary sustenance, food, or drink. It's legal language and difficult for me as a veterinarian to understand. But I know some basic things about the law. One is it does not require somebody who is responsible for an animal's welfare, health, to intend to hurt the animal to be charged with misdemeanor animal cruelty. If you're responsible for an animal, you have to be responsible for its health and welfare, and even if you didn't intend harm, which is difficult to prove, you can still be charged with misdemeanor animal cruelty, so there's no intent. The other part is that some states say that it's necessary for a person to provide an animal with veterinary care if it needs veterinary care. And there's nowhere in this law that it says that, but the way laws work is that, yes, somebody writes it, but then it has to be applied. And this law has been used for the last 150 years. And so there are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of cases where this law has been used in New York State. And depending on what happens in the trial, whether a person there's some particular event, is that person found guilty? That's called case law. That's how the law has been interpreted over the last 150 years, and that's just as significant as the way the law is written. And sustenance has actually come to mean that you have to provide an animal with care. So part of that would be veterinary care. And that is how the law has been interpreted, and that's when a jury is given instructions as to how the interpretation of the law, that's what they're told. This is the felony statute. It's called aggravated cruelty to animals, and this is New York State again. And here there is intent, meaning there's language, intentionally kills or intentionally causes serious physical injury. This law is less than 20 years old. So there's been an evolution in not only the understanding of veterinary forensic medicine, animal law. Laws have changed as well in the last 20 years. And now across the country, there are misdemeanor and felony laws addressing animal cruelty in all 50 states. And animal fighting as well is now in all 50 states. The veterinarian can have two roles In animal cruelty cases, you can be the complainant if you're a veterinarian, meaning you see an animal in front of you, and you might be the person who makes what's called a good faith report to law enforcement about suspected animal cruelty. And in that case, you would be recognizing and reporting animal cruelty. So there's that phrase that's been used both for child abuse and animal abuse. Or you may function as a forensic veterinarian, meaning you are the veterinarian who evaluates the animal who's a suspected victim of cruelty, and you collect the information, you document your findings, and then you're practicing forensic veterinary medicine or legal medicine. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Like, what is a Class A misdemeanor? Like, can you compare it to like something else?
No. No, I can tell you, oh, I'm sorry, what is a Class A misdemeanor? So I know that the penalty for the misdemeanor is up to a year in jail, and it's either a $5,000 or $10,000 fine. And I think that the penalties probably sort of tell you what the grade of the felony is. And the E-felony, which is what aggravated animal cruelty is up to 2 years in jail. Maybe that's a $10,000 fine. I'm not completely sure, but I think that that's probably an answer. But it's a very good question, because it is not unusual for veterinarians doing this to be asked questions about the law. I mean, it makes some sense, but at this point, I tend to defer to attorneys, recognizing that I'm not an attorney. But I think, at least my understanding is that the different grades of misdemeanor and felonies have a lot to do with the penalties. Anybody else? Yes? In the back?
The New York State Animal Protection Federation has a cell phone app, so if you want to access New York State law, it's categorized and it's nicely presented for individuals who want to find out information.
And it's the New York State Animal Protection Federation has an app. A smartphone app is what?
Free app. Our police officers, our enforcement use it.
That's great.
If you want to know ag and markets laws there, dangerous animal, Article 26 is there, everything's there, veterinary section is there. So it has a lot of useful information. It's well organized and it's updated.
So an app by the New York State Animal Protection Association. And
Station is responsible for primarily being in Albany and looking at trying to pass the law.
okay, they're based in Albany and work with the legislature on trying to pass laws that pertain to animals. Veterinary reporting. All 50 states mandate certain professionals and institutions to report suspected child abuse, but there's no equivalent established uniform reporting of animal abuse. I should say that the mandated reporting law varies from state to state, just the way the laws vary from state to state. There are currently 30, well, this is from an AVMA article on reporting requirements from 2014. It may have changed slightly, but at that time, there were 32 states that had some law related to veterinary reporting of animal cruelty. That means 18 states had nothing that gave veterinarians guidance as to reporting of animal cruelty. In the 32 states that make a legal provision for veterinary reporting of animal cruelty, one of the following may apply. Veterinarians may be mandated to report some aspect of animal cruelty. In some cases, only felony level animal cruelty or animal fighting reporting are mandated. Or a state may say that a veterinarian has immunity from civil and criminal prosecution when making a good faith report of suspected animal cruelty. Or the veterinarian may be allowed to report. So it varies across the country, and the only way to know is to look up what the particular law is in a particular state. Somebody else had a question? Yes?
Can you just clarify, or I'm sure you can clarify it back there, the definition of a county SPCA? I know some have humane law, or some will do humane law enforcement and some will not. And I think there can be only one SPCA per county in New York State. Is that true?
That I don't know. Do you know about New York State?
I don't know it to be that.
Okay.
Most of the locals do not have
So the response was that most counties, the SPCAs, don't have law enforcement function, and they may rely on local PD to do that. Now, whether local PD actually does it is a different question. This is the reporting law in New York State, which is 13 years old, and it says that it provides veterinarians with immunity from civil and criminal prosecution when making a good faith report of suspected companion animal abuse. So it doesn't provide legal protection for farm animal reporting. However, I do know that people have talked about how there are Good Samaritan laws in every state which allow anybody to report any suspected crime. So I'm not sure. You'd have to talk to an attorney as to whether or not how that works in New York State. Even before this law, we didn't pay much attention to whether we should report or not. We just reported. Somebody here may have other information. I'm not familiar with a case where a veterinarian made a good faith report and that there were any consequences to that. Yes? You've been sued for making a report of suspected animal abuse? Anybody else?
Who was she sued by?
I was sued by people who it was against because they didn't have a good enough case, so they sued me, the people who were cruel to these animals were dying. And I was asked by the police to be an expert witness, and then I got countersued.
So she was sued by the people who were alleged to be the perpetrators. What was the resolution, if you don't mind me asking?
The resolution was I did not have to pay anything. They didn't fined anything. Lots of dead animals, and it just kind of went away. Small town.
So small town, and there were, for you, no legal or financial consequences, but you had to go through that experience. There are lots of ways to classify animal cruelty. You can classify it by the number of animals, so there are what are called small-scale cases. Then there are large-scale cases with many animals, hoarding situations, puppy mills, dog-fighting operations. And the other way is to classify it based on what's actually happened to the animal, what's happened to their health. And so the two broad categories are neglect. We're really talking about neglect that rises to the level of a crime. So it has to result in the animal being injured. It has to result in the animal experiencing pain. And then non-accidental injury, which is, the opposite of accidental injury. So I always thought it was an odd term, but it makes some sense. And frequently, if you read about it, they just abbreviate it NAI. So the basic types of things we see with neglect are long-term inadequate nutrition, may be determined to be starvation. To some extent, starvation is not used in the law, as you saw. You do have to provide animals with food and water, so it just is adequate to say that they haven't been provided with food for a long term. Hair coat matting, but it has to be extreme. I'll show you a couple of cases where the animal's completely matted, and then there are strangulating mats. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that. It's usually small, long-haired dogs like a Maltese. The hair literally wraps tightly around the paw and can cause severe injury to the paw to the extent that it cuts off circulation and the animal may lose the leg as a result. So that's why that would be considered criminal. There can be what's called a failure to treat, so the animal has a serious medical problem and the people do not provide for care, and that's that sustenance part of the law. For instance, the dog hit by a car, sustains a broken leg, and they put the dog out in the backyard. Embedded collars, and again, it would depend on the degree of injury, but there can be very serious injury if you don't pay attention to what's going on with something as simple as a collar. And then abandonment in New York State of an animal is considered criminal. It's not considered cruelty. You can have an animal abandoned in very good health. It's still considered a crime. It's considered a violation, doesn't rise to the level of a misdemeanor, and the person would be given a summons, but it's still considered a crime. So in New York, for instance, it would not be unusual for somebody to call NYPD and say there's a dog tied up to a fence somewhere. And then they'll go retrieve it. Now, a lot of times they cannot determine, who the dog belonged to. They do look for video surveillance. We scan for a microchip. But if we can't determine who abandoned the dog, at the very least, the dog has been rescued. So there's still a tremendous benefit to a response to all of that, and that's happening on a regular basis. Yes?
Why is severe obesity not considered cruelty?
Probably, I would guess, but it's a bit of a guess as to the way the law is written, which is that you have to provide food. Providing too much food, it may change over time. It would take for some district attorney to decide that they want to prosecute the case. Problematic that you could probably stand outside the door of any animal hospital and arrest people all day long. So, I guess it's considered worse to starve an animal than to overfeed it. But I don't. The question is why is obesity not considered animal cruelty? Obviously, it has serious medical consequences for the animal. Yes.
I'm sorry, but in New York, I see embedded collars and all that stuff, and the DA never wants to prosecute those, where I live.
So how things are prosecuted, as I mentioned, vary from state to state because the laws vary, but they're going to vary within a state based on, how animal cruelty is perceived, both by law enforcement and the district attorney's office. So the point was made that in some locations, an embedded collar would not be prosecuted as animal cruelty because the criminal justice system is not seeing that as a crime. And this is a very human endeavor. There's no question about this. It's people that decide how to pursue it. And even if a veterinarian reports that, there may not be anything that happens as far as a prosecution, but that can change also. So it depends. And one of the hopes we have for what's going on in New York City with the ASPCA and NYPD partnership is other police departments will take notice of that. And that they'll start to look at, well, what are they doing in New York City? And that may change how this is handled in other parts of the state and across the country. Non-accidental injury, blunt force trauma, it's where there's an impact of an animal with a blunt object. Either the blunt object is in motion, or the animal could be in motion, or both could be in motion. You can throw an animal against the wall, you'll have blunt force trauma injuries. Sharp force is just what it says. It's got to be a sharp object. Gunshots, there can be chronic abuse, battered animals, or it's also called repetitive trauma. There's evidence of injuries at different stages of healing. Animal fighting, both dog fighting and cockfighting. Animals are inappropriately bound to limit movement, to limit them from barking, maybe to tie their muzzle shut so while you're hurting them, they don't bite you. Animals are burned, drowned, and poisoned. So pretty much what people do to each other, they do to animals. Yes?
So for, hit by car animals, whether the person swerves to hit or just doesn't see, but then they drive off, does that fall anywhere there, as a blunt force?
We've had a few cases in the last couple of years. The question is, if an animal is hit by a car, would it be considered a crime if the person drives off? And we've had a few cases in the last few years. I don't think they tend to go anywhere. It's very difficult to prove that the person intended to hit the animal or to some extent even knows that they did hit an animal. New York City is a pretty crazy place to drive a car. It's not my favorite thing to do. And I can see things happening where people are actually just not aware. It's very difficult to prove that the person intended to do that or even know that they did that. There was one case where someone it was clear that they intentionally meant to injure the animal and they were prosecuted. Yes?
Quite often, it in Pennsylvania, if you hit a dog and it damages your car, the owner of the dog is the one at fault and responsible for the damage to your car, not the other way around.
So somebody made the point that in Pennsylvania, if you hit a dog with your car, the owner of the dog is responsible if there was damage done to the car. It must have to be in a location where there is a leash law, I would assume. Yeah, so if there are leash laws, then the animal's supposed to be on a leash, and if there's damage done to the car, not considered a crime by the person driving the car, but the person who owns the animal. Different reasons to suspect animal abuse when an animal is injured can be both based on medical history and actual clinical findings. So sometimes somebody just confesses. You know, they said that they did this, and there are definitely situations where they say that because they don't think it has any significance. Meaning they're confessing to a crime, but they don't think that it was a crime, so that's why they're saying what they say. It could be, and this is very common, the account of the accident does not fit with the injury observed. There may be discrepancies in the history, more than one explanation. It may be that you make a phone call, the person makes a phone call, says that this happened to the animal, they show up at the veterinary hospital, the story has changed, they get into the exam room, they talk to the nurse or technician, the story has changed again, they talk to the doctor, and after a lot of questioning, so that happens a lot. And it's very important as the people tell the stories to what happened to the animal that you document the discrepancy and that the story is changing. It could be that there are multiple people involved and the story coming from each person is different. You see that on TV, you know, they put the two possible perpetrators in different rooms and they tell one that the story is different or, you know, that kind of thing. But that actually does happen. It may be that the behavior of the person arouses suspicion. Person is reluctant to give an explanation for injuries or becomes defensive or angry when questioned. And this isn't, you know, proof, it's circumstantial, but it may be based on the totality of the picture, information that makes you suspect that there was animal cruelty. This is in, a number of these are in the Helen Munro and Ronald Munro text. So more medical history, review of medical records may uncover a history of trauma. And so, you know, it's good practice anyway to be reading a medical record for an animal if there have been previous visits. Maybe the current medical condition is connected to a previous medical condition. Maybe something that the animal's really not in a situation where it would be exposed to a traumatic event. Maybe it's simply an indoor animal. How does it show up with a broken leg? And obviously there are accidents, but there are reasons that you might start to suspect animal cruelty. And then it may be that the animal's caught in the larger problem of family violence, and that we see a lot. And as I said, if there's one overriding message from this series of lectures, it's you can't separate what happens to the animals to what's happening with people. So from the Kempe article, a marked discrepancy between clinical findings and historical data as supplied by the parents is a major diagnostic feature of the battered child syndrome. It's the same discrepancy when a veterinarian may lead a veterinarian to suspect animal abuse. Perpetrator always has a story. You know, there's always a story because the question is asked, how did this happen? So it may be that, you know, and I've heard this a number of times. Well, I haven't heard it personally, but this is what has been told to me. The animal fell while it was being bathed. How serious do you think an animal can be injured if you're bathing it? Falling off couches is a common explanation for serious injuries. So here's a story, the account of the accident doesn't fit with the injury observed. A woman gives her boyfriend a puppy as a present. He calls her early in the evening saying the puppy doesn't seem right. She says, we'll take it to the veterinary hospital. Calls back a few hours later. He has not taken the dog to the veterinary hospital, and she convinced him to do that. When he got to the veterinary hospital, it was the story that the dog fell while it was being bathed. These are blunt force trauma injuries. The puppy had a hemothorax, hemoabdomen, liver lacerations, 7 rib fractures, and it died 20 hours subsequent to admission. The injuries identified could not have happened as a result of an accident while bathing the puppy. So the digital imaging has changed our report significantly. We write we call veterinary statements, and we put both photographic digital images and radiographic images, and then we'll label them. I use Adobe Photoshop Elements. I don't alter the image at all, but I label it because an attorney, law enforcement, will not be able to look at that and see where the rib fractures are. So I simply label it so that they can see the injuries. During the investigation, it was discovered that she had given him a second dachshund puppy earlier, and that puppy had died as well. And he confessed to having killed that. Law enforcement exhumed the body, and we were able to show a skull fracture. And that's significant because skull fractures, rib fractures, which this puppy had, are very common injuries to see in animal abuse cases. And they are not common in motor vehicle accidents or another type of event where you can expect trauma and injury to an animal. So he was sentenced to 4 months in jail, which he serves just on weekends, 5 years probation. If you don't know what probation is, it means you can't get in any other trouble with law enforcement during a 5-year period, which is hard for these people because they're criminals, and they go back to jail, even if they're done with their jail time during that period that they're on probation. Also, an 8-year non-possess order. He's not allowed to live or work where there are animals for 8 years. Mandated psychiatric and anger management sessions. So, clinical signs associated with animal abuse, repetitive injuries, or what has been called a battered animal. The animal presents repeatedly with traumatic injuries. They're injuries of different ages. The injury type may vary with each episode, but fractures feature prominently. The injury type cannot be explained by an accident. No history of accidental trauma, such as a motor vehicle accident, but still, again, there is a different type of pattern of injury seen with physical abuse and motor vehicle accidents. It is possible to look at an animal and say, this is not consistent with a motor vehicle accident, where, for instance, the most commonly fractured bone in a motor vehicle accident is the pelvis. We see a lot of rib fractures on both sides of the body, skull fractures with physical abuse cases. So there is a difference. And rib fractures, as I said, are prominent. This is from a human forensic pathologist saying that blunt force trauma due to falls to the ground, there should be a distribution based on a single impact, one side of the body over the bony prominences of the body. And if you start to see trauma at different locations on the body in areas that are relatively protected, you have to suspect there's something other than just an accident. This is a paper that we did with Tufts, and we compared injuries in motor vehicle accidents. They had over 400 motor vehicle accidents from Tufts Small Animal Hospital, and then we had 50 physical abuse cases from the ASPCA in New York City. So motor vehicle accidents, thoracic injury of the lungs is common. So pulmonary contusions, almost half of them. Pneumothorax, close to a third. Again, pelvic, sacral fractures, close to a fifth. Degloving injuries and abrasions. There's very specific type of abrasion you see with motor vehicle accidents where they're like these chunks of tissue that are missing. You won't see that in a physical abuse case. If you see it, then you say, yeah, that's consistent with a motor vehicle accident. But in non-accidental injury, scleral hemorrhage, 28%, skull fractures, close to a third, vertebral spinous fractures are actually relatively common. Tooth fractures, the head is a target. It's a target with people too. If people are trying to injure each other, the head is a target. Rib fractures, close to a third. Damage to claws is common. The animal's trying to get away, to fight. And then you can see older fractures, fractures that show signs of healing, so at least 2 traumatic events. So here's a little dog that was physically abused, and we get to work with the Animal Medical Center in New York City, and they can create a 3D CT image. And then it's very easy to see the fractures. So the left side is on the left here, the right side on the right, and then the same image is on the bottom, but I drew lines across showing how many impacts, at least the possibility that this shows all of the separate impacts. So if the fractures are aligned at the same place on the ribs, it's likely that they were from the same impact. So on the bottom right, for instance, here are 3 ribs where the fracture lines are at the same place, but then there are 3 ribs behind it where they're at a different place. So it's not exact, but it's reasonable way to show that there are multiple impacts here. This could not have happened as a result of an accident. And then there was head trauma associated with this also, and that right upper canine was actually pushed into the nasal passage. All of these will be used in court if the case reaches prosecution in court. Thing to remember about the prosecution, 90% of crimes in this country are resolved by plea negotiations. The majority don't go to trial. So you still have to manage the case as if it was going to trial, but if you collect appropriate information, you document it well, that's a reason somebody would take a plea. Because the defense counsel is going to look at the evidence against the person and say, you need to take a plea, because they will be found guilty if that shows up in court. It's not uncommon to say that a kitten has a skull fracture because it fell, but key motor development milestones in children is really well understood and become part of child abuse cases. And it's known that in kittens, they're able to right themselves in midair and land on their feet at about 6 or 7 weeks of age. And this is basic biology. You protect your head. If a person's going to fall, you don't leave your arms out. You protect your head. It's just basic biology that if you fall, you put your arms out to break your fall. Now, you may hurt your hands, your wrists, whatever, but to protect your head. And animals are the same way. So kittens can actually protect themselves by the time they're 8 weeks. So explaining head injuries by falls, especially severe head injuries, skull fractures, traumatic brain injuries, doesn't make sense. The same things that put children at risk, put animals at risk, the need for constant supervision, urination and defecation in the house, long-term chronic illnesses where there may be a significant financial burden, destructive, aggressive, or noisy behavior, or caught in the larger problem of family violence. I just want to show you one case before we finish. Forensic science identification, people are familiar with fingerprints, and now DNA is considered the gold standard. So we had this dog, a Rottweiler, come in. The individual said he had found it 2 weeks previously, chained to a pole in a park. He gave his address, phone number, and dog's name. There was a microchip scan. The microchip had been registered 5 months previously, same address, phone number, and dog name. So we were able, in that case, to give law enforcement crucial information to make him responsible for the animal's injuries. It was an embedded chain, and I know it was a chain because there was a classic pattern. There's like a beaded pearl pattern that's caused by the chain. You can see the thickness of the scar tissue on the ventral aspect of the neck. In addition, he was starved. He didn't look much like a Rottweiler when he came in. He did when he left, and he had a couple of healing rib fractures. This is the case I want to show you. This is a case that illustrates why you should be reading veterinary records. Obviously, it's appropriate medical practice, but in this case, it made all the difference in prosecuting this case. So Spike was born March 2009. There were 12 veterinary visits between the time he was 3 months old and 11 months old. The injuries that he sustained during that time were right front elbow fractures. All 3 bones involved pretty much destroyed the joint. A femoral neck, left hind femoral neck fracture, actually relatively common in abuse cases. Bilateral oral hematomas, injury to his right eye, and 3 maxillary tooth fractures. This is the timeline. We didn't see this animal, these visits. It was another veterinary hospital in New York City that saw all the visits except a couple of visits associated with the eye injury when an ophthalmologist looked at the dog. But he showed up at 3 months of age with a right oral hematoma. A month later, so 4 months of age, he had the right elbow fracture. He'd been limping since the night before. The next month, a left oral hematoma. 3 months later, the left femoral neck fracture. The eye injury a few months later. And we don't know when the maxillary tooth fractures were, when they occurred. We identified him when we finally got Spike to look at, but they hadn't been identified at the other veterinary practice. So here's his right elbow. We take advantage of having a radiologist in New York who we send the radiographs to electronically, but we also take advantage now of Dr. Elizabeth Watson, who is working on developing an expertise in forensic cases. So she's a forensic radiologist. She's based in Florida and does remarkable reports and turns them around really quickly. So this is just the radiographs showing the injury to that leg, right distal humeral lateral condyle fracture repaired and healed, chronic non-union fracture of the right radial head, ulnar notch is misshapen and sclerotic, severe secondary right elbow or osteoarthritis, premature closure of the distal right radial physis, subluxation of the right radiocarpal joint, and the left of the right radius short in the left. So I couldn't do this. But a radiologist can do that, and tremendous additional evidence for case prosecution. So here's the femoral neck injury, and they did a FHO. There was also left stifle effusion. There may be some avulsion fragments in the right stifle. Sorry, left stifle. This is a video taken by a teenager. In New York City, you can have one street, a series of buildings, then there is actually space in between them where people can have a small backyard. And so he's looking at the back of the other building that faces the other street, and that porch there is what you should keep your eye on. If I can make this work. This is Spike. So teenager knows something's going on in that household with Spike, and he sits out there one day to do this, to record this with his cell phone. And video surveillance has become super important in a lot of cases. We've done a lot of cases where we get video surveillance showing the animal abuse, or it fits into the case in a different way. But in this case, he started screaming at that individual. And then he posted the video on YouTube, of course. But he also did provide it to law enforcement. And law enforcement now had the video, and they went by that house and asked what was happening with the dog. And the people said, nothing's happening with the dog. Then they showed them the video. So the story is there's a husband, a wife, and a 12-year-old boy. That was the wife in this particular case, which is a little bit unusual, but I've seen it a number of times where the woman is actually the perpetrator. And the husband seemed to not be aware of what was happening. He was the one that kept bringing the dog to the animal hospital. What happened as far as the prosecution in that case is they left the country. because she would have been prosecuted for felony animal cruelty. It would have been successful when you see all of the documentation of his injuries, and she would have spent time in jail, significant amount of time, up to a year or two. So they actually left the country as a result. My concern in that case certainly is Spike as a veterinarian, but I'm very concerned about that child. You know, that child had to have witnessed abuse. If a child is exposed to that, it is considered child abuse. So we see this a lot, and again, another reason that it's good NYPD is the complainant, because they're responsible if there's child abuse. Also, they're responsible if there's domestic violence. So it's all sort of coming together, and it's a better way to enforce the law to have the local PD being the ones that are actually responding to complaints. That's, I think I'm just a couple of minutes over, but thank you.